Hello, thank you for joining us and welcome to our roundtable discussion on labors of love and care work. How do we nurture caregivers under capitalism? This is part of our Future of Work grassroots fundraising campaign. We want to thank our sponsors, and if you feel compelled to contribute after hearing our thoughts, feel free to donate. There's a link in the description box below. So I'm Ari, I'm a legal fellow at the Law Center. I mostly work with our land and housing clients and would love for the rest of the discussion participants to introduce yourselves as well. Jay, if you
Hi,
want to.
yeah, hi everyone. My name is Jay Cumberland. I'm an attorney at the Law Center with Ari. Um, I work on a lot of our different kinds of work. I work on our labor work and also on our housing and land work as well. I'll pass it over to Monte.
Hey everybody, I'm Wende Inahosa. I'm the Director of Communications and Strategic Storytelling at the Law Center. Besides doing our comms work, I get the privilege of doing a lot of other operations work, like in our finance work, abundance, and our internal resilience circle, which I feel like has a lot of relevance to this discussion because basically we do a lot of the organizational care work. So happy to be here today.
Peace, y'all. I'm Beryl Powell, he, him pronouns. I joined the Sustainable Economies Law Center back in August as a staff attorney and have been really loving the experience of working at a worker self-directed nonprofit for the first time. And I work on labor, land, and some housing policy work. So all three of our major substantive areas I have my hands in some capacity.
Awesome. So just to give a little backstory of how we're coming into this conversation, we started digging into this because of some issues with family zoning designations that our housing clients were experiencing. So we started reading Emmy O'Brien's Family Abolition, Capitalism, and the Communizing of Care. And it made us start thinking about what it would be like at the Law Center to be building towards a horizon where the work of social reproduction, the work of sustaining ourselves and reproducing ourselves from generation to generation was collectivized outside the confines of the private family. So this book is going to have a lot of influence over our conversation, and we're grateful to Emmy O'Brien and for opening up a new door and space for us at the Law Center. So just to get us started, maybe people can give some more backstory into how we came into. Jay, if you want to get us started.
Yeah, of course. So, like Ari was talking about, we originally we got to this book. We started as a working group focused on the definition of family in zoning law. We had some clients where they had a decent number of unrelated people living together in a single family home, and it was technically out of compliance with zoning law, which required that those people be some kind of like functioning as some form of family. And we felt that that was really strange, and we wanted to understand it together and figure out why that law was so restrictive. And so we had a working group focused on either trying to completely remove family as something that was relevant to residential zoning law so that anybody could live anywhere regardless of whether they looked like a family or not. And sometimes some of us were wanting to like abolish it at times and remove that language. Some of us thought maybe it was more strategic to expand the definition of family, like some jurisdictions have done, to specifically reference polyamorous families and other types of families, just to expand the container of the term. And I think we got to Emmy O'Brien's book, Family Abolition. Viral and Ari, I think you had both already read it, perhaps, and you suggested it as a way to help us really understand what family meant and why it was, what the purpose of family was, and sort of the political history in the term, so we could get some kind of shared strategy for this, because I feel like we could never center in on what exactly we wanted to do, and we needed to really figure out what was the family, how was it relevant, what was our political orientation to it, and this book really helped.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
Beryl,
yes, for sure. Just to expand on that, I think it was helpful for us to collectively take a step back to really interrogate what is our personal definition of family, or how do we think of the term when it's brought up? And I think when I first got brought into this policy work, we were kind of at a go mentality, right? Because you and our other our resident legislative guru Hope were already like deep into the weeds of legal research and really trying to make a proposal for this current legislative cycle. And when we realized that, you know, we're not going to have something coherent and sort of something that would be endorsed this legislative cycle, we collectively decided, let's take a step back. And I think that's really helpful. And you roped me in actually, because I published a law review article back in 2022 entitled Grassroots Movement Lawyering, which in part used a queer radical framework to highlight the George Floyd movement in 2020. And I kind of analyzed how that disrupted traditional cisgender and heteronormative family norms, particularly when I was looking at the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone in Seattle, where protesters had seized a 6 to 8 block radius for about a month and transformed it into this liberated space that was collectively run and managed. And so like I was talking about the queering of social relations, including the family form that happened in this space. And so you were like, well, what we're doing policy-wise isn't exactly what you wrote about, but it's closely related enough. And I warmly received your invitation. And I thought, and Ari and I were already thinking of reading Family Abolition together. And what better opportunity to kind of like make this even a bigger sort of read among all of us here at the Law Center. And so I'll also say that this is kind of like a very significant, at least in my perception, a significant type of text that an organization like ours, being legal, is engaged in, right? Because Emmy O'Brien is explicitly a revolutionary, and she uses both the queer radical framework, but also writes from this like ultra left tendency of Marxism known as communization theory. And I think it's significant that, you know, the Law Center is engaging in this text because usually there's no overlap between movement lawyering organizations and revolutionary politics. And despite all the talk about maybe structural transformation that many movement lawyers preach, right? When you really interrogate, what does that mean in practice? What does anti-capitalism mean? They either don't know or provide basic variations of like, well, it's workers' control of the state apparatus, either electorally or through maybe constructing solidarity economy, but that still coexists with the state. And I think Emmy O'Brien's kind of text really puts that into a problem, right? Is the state, is the family, are these institutions co-constitutive of capitalism such that we need to abolish them? So I think it is significant, and not that we're all going to arrive at the same place, but just reading it and allowing ourselves to sit with it and interrogate some of the real-time practical implications to what our lawyering means, I think is really significant.
Thanks for diving into some of that backstory. So family abolition is a pretty dramatic declaration. How would you all define family abolition? I don't know, one day if you want to kick us off with that.
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's so funny. I think it's really important to define it. I was telling my husband about the book and how interesting it was. And when I told him the title, he was like, whoa, 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 that's really extreme. So I think it's important for me to define family abolition as abolishing the conditions, the structures and the institutions that center and prioritize cis heteronormative white kind of family structures, you know, the mom, dad, 2.5 kids and a picket fence, the kind of family structure that is prioritized within the law as well. So it's not like, oh, are you a married couple with kids? Abolish them. That's not what they mean. They mean that it's the universalizing and making freely available care to everyone by making the resources and the structures getting rid of the structures that I just said and making them more freely available to everybody. So I'm curious, yeah, Jay or Veryl, how do y'all define it?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. And I think you're talking about the structures, and I think Amy O'Brien gets names a few different pieces of the structure that are are ripe for abolishing, that are sort of the constrictive elements of those that relate to capitalism and the way that what Ari called this socially reproductive work, this work of keeping society going that's really informal for most of the time. I think some of the pieces, family abolition is about removing the linkage between sort of romantic partnership and economic partnership, where the sort of this couple, like if you're a married couple, like my wife and I, like we're romantic partners, but we're both also economic partners. Like she recently lost her job a few days ago, and so like now our economics are impacted, but also our romance. Like, why are those two things linked? It's about changing that so that who you have sex with, who you love, doesn't um, mean so much for your economic sort of safety. Um, it's also about how the family, abolishing the privacy aspect of the family. I think there's both privacy in two senses. It's abolishing, like, well, I guess it's both physical, both in a way, physical privacy. It's like the privacy of the house, like living within a house where the child, like your relationships with your child are fun primarily within your own home. It's about abolishing that because that facilitates abuse. It can facilitate love. There can be love within that, but it also hides a lot of abuse and like is a breeding ground for that. And so like making the family more public in that sense, more open to intervention by multiple people in a society, and also making the family less private in the sense of being this sort of refuge from society, this depoliticized space where you go to sort of rest and relax. It's saying, no, that's not what the family should be. This family is not a refuge. This family is a crucial piece of the puzzle along with the state and the wage in like changing society. So it should be a politicized space. And not just this private space where you go. It's like a place of refuge. And it's about collectivizing that labor of reproduction, the cooking, the cleaning, the laundry, the child care, the elder care. It's about making sure that it's not like the nuclear family that's the fundamental piece of providing that, the sort of fallback, but that it's a more collective, it's a more communal place that we fall back to and that we locate those relationships of care. So it's abolishing the way that this is all condensed and pressed into the sort of nuclear family and sort of expanding that. There's also inherited wealth and the way that's coercive in a sort of family lineages. Yeah, that's my bullet point list. Vera, what did I miss?
No, I think that's really good. And I think it's also at the same time a critique of the state as like the alternative to, as a welfare provider to those who aren't in the nuclear family structure, right? And it's usually the state that comes in to provide those benefits, and or the state that regulates or responds to internal like family abuse or domestic violence. And so it's also a critique of, it's not that we're just trying to abolish the family as a site of privacy, but also family as a site of state regulation. And to take a step even further back, I should emphasize that O'Brien sees like the term abolition in this dialectical, like Hegelian way, right? It's not just about destruction, but it's about like what she says, like positive supersession, right? Preserving part of family in a new transformed form. And so I think that's, just crucial to remember in terms of like, to flourish as a human being, as a species of human beings, we all need to receive care and love and, you know, economic security, material security, in all the ways that allow us to flourish, right? And so again, it goes back to like collectivizing these sorts of necessary components that make us human, rather than just place it into the hands of the state or into the hands of the private family. And so in some ways, I'm kind of quite, even though she uses family abolition, there's some part of family that is retained. And I wonder, I pose this question to myself: is it really useful politically or legally to salvage the term family if so much of what we're critiquing should be really done away with, right? Can we just replace the term family with like communities of care or love? In some ways, to still say, to expand this version of family seems like some sort of rhetorical concession to placate some folks on the left who still cling onto some romantic version of the family. And to me, there seems to be something very parochial to family. And I wonder if it's just helpful to separate out precisely what we can salvage in a post-capitalist future. It's sort of like whether or not we want to cling onto racial identities in a post-capitalist future if we recognize now that the categorization is a problematic feature of capitalism designed to divide and exclude and render who's disposable. So anyways, yeah, I guess like family and race having some sort of parallel journeys of state recognition, where some family forms and racial identities are recognized and protected as being valuable and deserving of entitlements and rights, while others are not. But at the end of the day, whether we're still using the term family, I agree with O'Brien in the broader sense that all humans deserve love and care. So yeah.
Wow, thank you for all of your different additions to this question. How does the law define family? What have y'all seen through digging into this? I don't know, Jay, if you want to jump in from doing some of the more initial research on this.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of different law. I think the law that I'm most well positioned to speak to is the zoning law, because that's where we started this journey. So I don't know as much about family law and other pieces of law that define family. There's a lot of places where this is used, but in zoning law, there's the general definition of family is people related by blood, marriage, and adoption. So that's sort of the default definition of family. It's kind of what you imagine the nuclear family as, like two people related by marriage, kids related by blood, kids maybe related by adoption. And then so that definition itself has expanded as other things have changed, like with a Bergefell decision allowing gay marriage and stuff like that. That definition of family is now broader than it used to be, because who can marry is now broader than it used to be. And then there's a expansion of that term in the turn towards the functional family in zoning law. And this is not present in every state. So this is something that California has, which it allows families, blood, marriage, and adoption to live in dwelling units, but it also allows a functional family to live in those same places. And so a functional family is people not related by blood, marriage, and adoption, but it's like a group of unrelated people living together and sharing. I think the typical terms are like chores, responsibilities, expenses, experiences. It's kind of vague, but some localities will call this an intentional community. It's like a group of people that are intentionally structuring their relationships with each other. Sometimes there's law that will say this is like a group trying to mirror the generic family which I find very interesting. Yeah, and so that's how it defines it. And in zoning law, it's used to, the purpose of these definitions, which I feel like is important, is to allocate land and like to decide who can live somewhere and who can't live somewhere. So it's like families, two types of families can both live somewhere, but unrelated groups of people that are not like trying to be intentional about their relationships, but are just like seeking shelter or trying to have a place to live, are not allowed to live like in the same place as these families. So that's part of sort of the way that the family is structured. It's in this privacy and this separation from sort of the rabble of society through zoning.
Hmm. I'll mention a couple of things. One, so what you're describing as the law's expansion to include a variation of family as functional rather than biological, that's a welcome development because, starting in the 60s, the law really, through kind of single family households mobilizing politically at the local municipal level, they really passed nationwide a bunch of laws restricting the definition of housing to single family households, right? And so that was very much tied to notions of biological family, and really preserving nuclear family, because in the 60s you saw a wave of different movements really pressing up against the limits of the nuclear family form, right? Whether it was the civil rights, Black Power movements, and newer conceptions of family, because especially in urban areas where Black riots were going on, the family structure was just the nuclear family was not available to Black workers, right? And also simultaneously, you had this anti-Vietnam countercultural white hippie moment, right, or movement that really expanded this notion of living arrangements. So that happened in the 60s. So what you're saying, kind of a more recent development, Jay, that's a welcome thing. But at the same time, I like that you tied it into sort of like, at the end of the day, it's all still about land use. And ultimately, we're still in the system of private property ownership where the bottom line is the most important thing. Property values is the most important thing. So even though the law is recognizing non-traditional family arrangements in terms of who can reside in residential zones, it's still, ultimately when property values are, at risk, municipalities will still pass ordinances that restrict the size of family, if not, the definition of like family as biological versus functional, right? And so like, folks are usually, property owners are usually concerned about, their neighbor having a dozen people, right? And so they would want to pass an ordinance to restrict the size of any sort of living household to be, like 5 or 6 members max, right? So there, that's another piece to emphasize, that like, even though the law's expanded, much like what I'm saying, or what Jay was alluding to, sort of the gay marriage moment, where, like, state recognizes formerly excluded identities or formerly excluded family forms. It's a welcome development on the one hand, but we gotta question, what sort of backlash are we going to get, and what sort of harms or unintended consequences come with increasing recognition of non-traditional family forms. So.
Thank you. And this connection between families, private families, and access to land that we are seeing now has a long history in the development of racial capitalism. And I don't know, Farrell, if you want to say a little bit more about that history.
Yeah. So I'll say, that the development of racial capitalism was fueled by the violent processes of settler colonialism and enslavement. These are things that, in traditional Marxist terms, they call it primitive accumulation, like the conditions that enable further capitalist development, right? And these processes of settler colonialism and slavery, they required the violent, forcible separation and destruction of both indigenous and African ways of communal living and cosmologies, epistemologies. So, just as there was, material genocide and physical taking of life, there was also a cultural genocide through things like forced assimilation of children into boarding schools, and et cetera. The list goes on, right? I guess more contemporarily, I'd say a key thing to note is that racial capitalism continued to perpetrate through this nuclear private family form, right? And that family form was tied, its proliferation was tied to the success of the white workers' movement in the late 19th century, or pardon me, late 18th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, right? When industrial capitalism was at its apex here in the United States and the Western world. So one of the key points that O'Brien makes is that the workers' movement, its success depended on this reification of the family form to be a site to hold unwaged, socially reproductive labor that was so necessary to reproduce capitalism in totality, right? In this household of unwaged labor where women were relegated to, they were doing essential work of reproducing current wage laborers and current male wage laborers, right? And also bringing up the next generation of wage laborers and children, right? And so they were doing all this unwaged labor in the household to make that happen for capitalism to reproduce itself in totality. And so this was a racialized phenomenon because the workers' movement, as I alluded to, was exclusively a white movement of a more, I guess, privileged layer of workers who were able to gain recognition as a class of recognized workers with dignity, with pride. So the workers' movement was able to affirm itself as an identity of workers through, again, both like winning concessions by capitalists, because again, this was the apex of industrialization in the United States, where capitalists felt like they could offer some concessions to placate a section of the working class, of proletariat, to avoid broader class struggle. What if, for example, the Black struggle, the nascent Black, but certainly emerging Black struggle, coalesced with the white workers' movement? That would have been a huge threat to capitalists in the mid 20th century. And so a part of that success was kind of a meeting of the minds, an interest convergence between capitalists and the workers' movement to allow workers to be recognized in this sense, to also affirm itself through the private family form. And this came at the exclusion of workers being even more separated to other layers of the working class, what Marx would call the surplus population or the lumpen proletariat, those who are pushed out of the formal workforce because it was a racialized workforce, right? And so, so Black workers, sex workers, folks who were who were precariously employed. So there was an even further distance between white privileged workers and sort of gender racial minorities. And this in turn allowed white workers to gain the status, much like, Cheryl Harris writes, like whiteness is property. I would say like white and working class identities as a property interest, the wages of whiteness, to invoke Du Bois, and yeah, so this, in this sense, in a more contemporary historical framework, racial capitalism has been perpetuated through the workers' movement and its affirmation of the private family form.
Thanks for rooting us in that history, and bringing up some of the missteps along the way. O'Brien talks about a few different moments in history where people have attempted to abolish the family, and I'm curious to hear from each of you, what were your favorite examples that she gives? One day, if you want to start us off.
Yeah, there's a moment towards the end of the book where O'Brien goes through several points in history, and she talks a lot in one section about chosen family, which I feel like it is a moment. It's a continuing moment. There's definitely very specific examples that she gives, but I loved that she brought up chosen family at the end of the book, because I think for me, I have a lot of personal experience with chosen family. And specifically, she brings up poet and Black feminist theorist Alexis Pauline Gumbs' definition of mothering. I read Alexis Pauline Gumbs' book, Revolutionary Mothering, when I was pregnant with my daughter. And I remembered that she said mothering is natural work, the survival dance. And I think, like, remembering that and reading at the end of this book, and I think O'Brien brought up a specific moment in 1979 at the National Third World Lesbian and Gay Conference, a moment where Audre Lorde announced, "All children of lesbians are ours." And for me, it's like, did they effectively create a moment of family abolition? No, but I think they made clear that Black lesbians in that moment were being very clear about that we're all taking collective care and responsibility, and this idea of mothering, like, we're all coming together around this idea, and kind of like I don't know, making this dedication to each other as chosen family. And yeah, so I have a lot of love and respect for Black feminist theorists like Alexis Pauline Gumbs and Audre Lorde for making those statements in the past and continuing to influence us now, because I mean, Audre Lorde, it's like every other Instagram post, I feel like, is somebody quoting her, or like, she has such a huge thumbprint on the way that we all think about care work these days, and what it means to care for one another outside of gendered labels. I also really loved this definition of mothering outside of gender, because some of the most mothering people I know in my life are not women or mothers. And it reminds me of this conversation that I had with my husband when we had our daughter, like, what does fathering look like? But we both agreed that a lot of what he was doing, because we take care work very seriously in our family, was mothering. And that was really beautiful, this constant ongoing dance of survival. And I like how we're moving towards a future, and O'Brien's kind of reminding us in her book that, like, we're moving towards a future where you don't have to be a woman or a mother to value and see and be valued for the ongoing care that's required for the survival of your loved ones. So yeah, so just shout out to the Black feminist theorists.
Farrell, do you want to share one of your favorite examples?
Sure. Yeah. Also, one day I really loved reading Revolutionary Mothering too. That was a reading group text that I had a while ago. So thank you for sort of grounding your answer in that, and how it connects to your personal experience. I thought that's really powerful to hear. I think there are a number of examples. Maybe I'll quickly just like name a couple. One, she talks about how Black mothers who were recipients of cash transfer benefits like social welfare, like organize themselves into the National Welfare Rights Organization, really to push against how heavily regulated benefits were, how contingent benefits were to the status of this reification of dysfunctional Black families, right? Being the single household led by mothers. And in order to receive benefits, the state would heavily subject folks to mothers to means testing, behavior testing, by which it means that there's a restriction of Black sexuality. And like one example of that would be welfare organization or welfare or state welfare agencies rather collaborating with law enforcement to inspect whether a recipient would be cohabitating with a partner was sexually active by conducting these midnight raids at random. Such a huge, obvious like intrusion of privacy. But if it was determined that there was cohabitation, then the mother would be ineligible for benefits, right? And so the way that the NWRO organized against this was just demanding for something like a universal basic income, just as a rejection, a larger rejection of like, why should one's material well-being be contingent on either this like state constructed dysfunctional family form, which obviously perpetuates like racialized like stereotypes and constructs, but simultaneously why it was a critique of like larger sort of like capitalist work, right? And this idea of like everyone should be entitled this income because work under under capitalism is so unfreeing. It sucks. It's tied to profit accumulation by capitalists. And thus we are exploited as workers, and also as particularly as Black folks, Black women, we have labored so much involuntarily for generations under slavery. And so we just reject work, right? And I thought that was really a powerful moment in history she described. And I guess like to a quick other example, or perhaps Jay, you want to pick it up if you want to talk about the Oaxacan commune. And sort of like other sort of liberated zones. I sort of referenced this at the beginning in my own work around the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, but I think these liberated spaces are contemporary examples that really even move beyond this concept of income provided by the state. But it's like, how can we collectivize social reproduction through ourselves, through relying and trusting and caring for each other without the state having to step in between and mediate care for us. So I think that's another powerful concept she references.
Thanks for highlighting those two things, those two beautiful moments. I'm curious if there's ways and places you've seen our own clients do this work of collectivizing social reproduction. I think about Poor Magazine and their Homefulness project, where they're not just creating like permanently rent-free housing for people. They have their weekly sliding scale cafes where they're giving out diapers and free food and hot meals to other poor and unhoused people. They're running like a multi-generational school where they're teaching not just like math and science, but care for elders, how to do elder care, and running support groups. I think they call it like survival from isolation in America, KK, as Tani would say. So that's a model that I've seen with some of the groups we work with. I'm curious if other people have as well, have other things to highlight.
Yeah, I personally, what comes to mind right now is our land back and rematriation work, and by which I mean just like returning stolen land to indigenous folks. And so, one of our clients, Segurite Land Trust, what's really exciting, in the framing or perhaps reframing from repatriation to rematriation is just this acknowledgement, much like, how you describe one day of mothering, like indigenous women have been central in protecting and caring for land across the generations. And so the work of rematriation is restoring connections to not just indigenous folks, but the rest of us settlers in building a healthier, more biodiverse ecosystem against this looming context of climate destruction, where so that our future generations can thrive, right? But I think of this in terms of collectivizing care because once rematriation is sort of being facilitated, oftentimes Segurite will work with other movement partners or other sort of life-affirming organizations to co-steward the land, like whether it's like a BIPOC-led school on rematriated land. But this sort of co-stewarding of land is really it gestures at like collectivizing work of social reproduction, and instead of like formal transactions where you have multiple parties, kind of spelling out what rights or obligations will exist on a piece of rematriated land. We're really developing rituals and care-based agreements where everyone feels like they have some collective responsibility in stewarding the land for the current and future generations. So I think of that, and I also think I'm inspired by this concept of Hemetka, which again I've learned from the Segurite Land Trust, but some of these sites are being kind of stewarded for both like farming, but like kind of like healing medicine garden, and also like housing for emergency supplies for the community. And so like I see, particularly when conditions of crises accelerate and or natural disaster strikes, there are these Hemetka sites that are available for communities to come to for solace. And it goes beyond, obviously, just dependency on, biological family and, traditional nuclear family form to be a site of relief.
Nice. And maybe if people want to share how this like it impacts them personally, if like some how Emmy O'Brien talks about how like the pandemic really brought to the forefront for a lot of people just how impossible it is for a singular nuclear unit of a family to do all of the reproductive work that it takes for us to survive. If anyone on this panel wants to share kind of, yeah, how that experience impacts them, their caregiving, and their labor. And
Yeah, I can jump in. Gosh, how did it changed everything? I think we all can agree that what was laid bare was how inextricably connected we are and interdependent we are. The supply chain issues brought up so much anxiety for me around food access and just how tenuous my access to healthy, clean, delicious food is during the pandemic, which made me appreciate so much more farmers, local farmers. And I think also, so those kind of, I think for me, what my perspective shifted in terms of like, what does safety mean? I think we in the United States that are generally, you know, well-fed, well-paid, live comfortably. During the pandemic, the illusion of safety was shattered, and there is no safety. There's no guarantee, you know, every day is a gift, which I think we all learned in the pandemic. But I think like trying to connect this back to like essential labor and caregiving, like safety is about I'm safe if my neighbor's safe, if my family's safe, if my cousin's safe, you know, like the more we all realized that our connection to food and water and good health is connected, the more safe we actually are. It's not this, you know, thinking about what you said, Jay, about privacy in the family and being in your little home, you know, who knows what goes on behind closed doors. And that is kind of like what we've developed as like a sense of safety in this country. But I think a lot of people around the world understand that like my safety is connected to your safety. So that really changed for me too. Another thing that really shifted for me, you know, like essential labor. I think people think, okay, like grocery store workers, nurses, doctors, farmers. But for me, artists, I mean, I love art, but I think like that's what kept me alive in the pandemic. Like, how many movies did we watch? How much music did you listen to? How many, you know, how many talks, how many beautiful images did you look at to kind of just like make it through another day? And so for me, I think in the future, in this beautiful horizon that we're all kind of discussing and reaching towards, honoring and centering artists in the care of like our souls, you know, because what happens when things are really dark and really really terrible and we don't know what's going to happen. We sing, we recite poetry, we paint, you know, like. So I really had a newfound respect and love for artists and seeing them as essential labor to just maintain my mental health, honestly. I don't know about you, Jay. I'd love to hear how your perspective shifted.
Yeah, that really, some of the things you said really jogged my memory and things that I feel like I had forgotten. um, I think the biggest thing that changed my perspective was I had a child in 2020 at the tail end of 2021. Um, so my wife and I were pretty isolated from like 2020 to 2021, trying to not get COVID while she was pregnant. And then afterwards for a few years. So I think and we both worked remotely. And so I think what Emmy O'Brien was talking about in the book is how for families that have historically been sort of wealthier or more privileged, like we were getting a taste of what life has been like for people that are less privileged and have less like have to cobble together networks of care for their kids and like support for themselves. Like everything was so condensed, and we're so isolated. I think I forget about like the formula shortages and stuff like that you mentioned, and then how important that was, how much work I did to like find this formula supplier to like get formula to our house, and they like refused to take on new orders because they were like, we're only going to serve our existing customers, we're not going to serve new people. Which is I just forgot about that. But I think like honestly what changed my perspective, I don't know if it was the pandemic. It's probably the pandemic on top of having a child, but just like how much more work it is, how much messier my house is, because and how much cooking and cleaning there is to do. A lot because like I am at home all the time and my wife is at home all the time and my kid was at home all the time. And then we were trying to work at the same time, like doing our waged work around that. And I was working like at night. And so I think like, yeah, I mean, that's where my focus is on, like, I feel like personally on family abolition. It's like how do I do less work in my kitchen? How do I do less laundry by myself? Like those fundamental things. Yeah, and I feel like all of that was just exacerbated so much during the pandemic and having a kid.
Yeah. Bring us back out to the law center. Uh, I'm curious how reading the book, thinking about this horizon of family abolition has impacted your reimagining of the kind of labor work we pursue. Varel, if you want to jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think to me, both the critique of family and the critique of work is tied to how these concepts are conceptualized under capitalism. And, both family and work, as we've said already in various ways throughout this recording, it has this net effect. I mean, it has the ultimate effect of reproducing capitalist economic and social relations. And a lot of these mechanisms or institutions are there to divide, separate, alienate us from one another as a human species, right? And I think of, for example, the household as being this very hyper-isolated site of exclusion, particularly, if we're thinking of the single male breadwinner household, like how women had been excluded from, other forms of solidarity with other care workers and reproductive workers, from other women who have been trapped in households as well. And really being a site, as a whole family where, all the grievances that you might have against this larger system of capitalism is funneled into this family form where, again, who knows what sort of abuses go on inside, as Mwende just said. And it's really, similarly, there's in terms of work under capitalism, again, oriented towards, profit accumulation. A lot of that is designed to really separate workers, again, from the broader, proletariat, those who fall, the racialized workers, the sexualized workers, and also, even within the working class in terms of facilitating, competition through incentives of bonuses or like, climbing up the career ladder. And so, to me, the work that we are doing here in the Law Center is really disrupting this feeling of atomization and alienation through promoting a cooperative spirit, a caring spirit, in bringing folks together through solidarity economy organizational forms, or reconnecting folks to the land, and I think, I think I did mention at the very top, I personally have critiques of like whether some of this work is just, kind of survival pending revolution. And I think it is. I mean, I think ultimately a lot of what I'm talking about still operates within a larger system of capitalism, but it begins to disrupt the most extreme and blatant and toxic forms of alienation and abuse that are proliferated under the private family and, capitalist work institutions. So, so kind of to the summary of what I'm saying is really just like what we do here as a baseline is promoting a spirit of cooperation. And I think we do a really good job of interrogating, well, we're not just going to continue representing a formal entity if it's just for the sake of it being called a cooperative. But I think we really work hard at, again, promoting a spirit of cooperation among human beings to bridge together, divides caused by identities and other separations that capitalism proliferates. And we do that starting with how we organize ourselves internally in self, right? And we do a lot of internal work, conflict resolution, but also really like learning so we can be more of a living embodiment of the caring relations we want to see in a post-capitalist future.
Anyone want to jump in and add to how this book is impacting our work, or more generally, like your thoughts on how we nurture caregivers within capitalism?
Yeah, I think in terms of our work, I think the question you asked was like, how does this help us reimagine our labor work? And I think one of the things Beryl pointed out was that our labor work has historically, I feel like, been really focused on worker cooperatives and like solidarity economies and those types of structures. And those are kind of the formal, a lot of times those are for people that are waged workers, not the most precarious workers in society that have sort of attached themselves to the family form or can avail themselves of this family form. And I think one of the things that I really liked hearing Beryl, you insist on in our labor work is how do we address the fact that there is kind of this divide in the working class between this kind of more historically more like respectable working class of people that can attain this stable sort of nuclear family form, and then this like increasingly precarious part of the workforce. Like, how do we talk about both of those types of like formal waged labor where people are making money? Because I feel like we've historically done a good job of like talking about the less precarious and occasionally the more precarious, but like how do we make sure we hold both of those together and don't just do the work where it's easiest, which is for those people that can form a worker cooperative and have enough income to sort of sustain themselves. And then I think the bigger piece that I've learned is also like if we're going to talk about labor, like what is contained within that? Like I feel like it has historically been just wages. Like how do we change the way we make money? Like that has been our labor work for as long as I've known Salk, and I feel like now it's that container in my mind feels larger, and I feel like that's a really beneficial framework. Like labor is waged labor, but labor is also all these things that we don't get money for. It's the things that, like, all right, when you use that term socially reproductive work, it's the domestic work that we do in our households, mostly in the private households, but also outside of the households too. And so how do we work towards the liberation of both sort of unwaged domestic work and waged work at the same time? One of the pieces of Emmy O'Brien's book that felt really important, that makes it feel important to talk about both of those together in our labor work, is Emmy O'Brien talks about the Oaxaca Commune, which Beryl mentioned earlier, which was sort of a communal uprising in 2006 in Oaxaca, Mexico. And a critical piece of that was that women were out of their private homes for one of the first times, like having this collective space, defending barricades, defending the commune. And the family was a sort of reactionary force in that moment, suppressing that revolutionary energy of that commune. And Emmy O'Brien notes that to change like society, to make it better, we have to address both the state, like our governing institutions, and also wages, how we make money, but then also the family, because if you address the state and the economy without addressing the family, it can be sort of this counter-revolutionary force. And so I think that's really made it central in my mind that we have to talk about the family as part of our work, as part of changing society. And I don't think that we've done that really historically at the Law Center. And I think it demands like new conversations and new learnings about how to talk about like gender, how to talk about sexuality, how to talk about queerness, how to talk about family, like in ways that we haven't done. And it really seemed critical to our work. I feel like that's really, it felt like it expanded my mind, and like I still don't know what that means, but like that feels like it's reimagining our work and how we talk routinely at the Law Center. And we're like in that process. I think the other piece of it is that for me it means that our labor work, that means that housing is labor and land is labor. Like housing is this fundamental site of social reproductive labor. Like this is where that labor happens. We talk about like worker cooperatives, and it's like changing the governing structures, changing how our businesses work so that it feels better in those spaces. And it also feels like we have to talk about housing and like changing the way that that physical structure works so that we can change the way that socially reproductive work happens. Like how can we make this less private? How can we make it more communal? And how can we change these places? So it feels like it's kind of like it feels like it's given like a framework where we can relate our work together as a whole for me. But, yeah.
Jay said something that I kind of want to jump off on, if that's okay. You would also pose the question, Ari, how do we nurture caregivers under capitalism? So I'm kind of like holding that question in my head with something that Jay said about like how we think about labor more than just waged labor and unwaged labor. And something that we talk a lot about at the Law Center is little d democracy, and how like been advocating for worker self-directed nonprofits and workers in their workplaces to have more of a voice and say in how the work happens, how the work is delegated. People get an opportunity to practice little d democracy. They get an opportunity to practice kind of like, you know, selfhood in a way, you know, like a way to assert your needs and your voice within the workplace. I'm thinking about labor in that way right now. There's something that you said, Jay, that made me think like we need more opportunities to practice extractive or monetary labor, you know, like I've been in Bolivia for the past 10 months, and something that I've witnessed that's so beautiful here is there's so much organizing that's just part of daily life that people don't even see it as organizing, because these are essentially kinship networks that are constantly fed and nourished because they're organized around, you know, community festivals, around holidays, around birthdays, funerals. All of these things are all actively and constantly keeping people in connection, giving and receiving of each other, non-monetary interactions between each other that are supportive and caring, but they're the only thing that's been given and receiving is support or care for each other. So I'm thinking about how like if somebody is gonna get married, the way that they engage the community here to, you know, some uncle's gonna find the venues, someone's gonna organize all of the beer that's gonna arrive, someone's gonna organize all of the abuelas that are gonna make the meal at the wedding. Like there's no monetary exchange. So I just feel like in the United States, in the West, so much of that has been privatized that we don't even see, or like we're not attuned to opportunities to interact and engage with each other and care for each other outside of the family that isn't like have to do with money or exchange. So I would love to see, like when I'm thinking about how do we nurture caregivers, I would love to just see more opportunities for people to come together and organize for something beautiful, you know. A small critique I have of O'Brien in this book is all of the examples that she offers around these moments where care is communized, they're almost always like moments of protest or insurrection, which is awesome. Like, I'm not against those things, but I would have loved to have examples in the book where people came together for something that wasn't protest. Because I think those are going to be the moments in the future, like when we can ritualize collective community, collective care, where we can come together. And it's not because we're going against something, but it's because we're coming together, outside of the support of the state, solely because we want to come together. For me, that's when this communizing of care will become sustainable. Because I think a lot of these examples that she gives, after a while, they fall apart for a multitude of reasons, which I'm sure Beryl or Jay could explain a lot better than me. I don't know. I just think that that's something that I wanted to highlight, that I thought that you, Jay, like, I don't know, there's something that you said about labor. I'm like, we just need more opportunities to practice. And then I also wanted to say one more thing on like how we nurture caregivers. Like, caregivers right now, especially, I mean, all over the world, but I'm thinking in the United States, like, we're struggling. It's a struggle to get food on the table. It's a struggle to keep the lights on. It's a struggle to see and spend time with your kids. Because it's like you got to commute to work, you got to work, you got to commute home, feed them, and then they're in bed, and you don't even get to see your family. So I think just like, I just wanted to put out there that um, like parallel to practicing this future where care is communized, we need to get the basics covered, we need to universalize healthcare, we need universal basic income, socialize, like all of these things that we're already fighting for, because it's really hard for regular people who are trying their best to care for their family and their community. It's hard for us to come together and organize and keep those organized, those networks fed and nourished when you're struggling, right? So, and that's by design, as we all know. But it's a lot trying to build the future while also trying to make the present better.
Yeah, I know we're kind of running up against time, but like what you said Monday just brought up a lot for me. Like, one, yeah, the last thing you said about, like, while, existing under the present conditions of capitalism, like how can we, you know, push for sort of quote unquote anti-family reforms in the terms of Emmy O'Brien. And one thing I'm recalling from her discussion of the wages for housework struggle, where that was a movement that happened in the 20th century by women in the household who demanded wages, but like the implication was just the gesturing was beyond just like, I want to get compensated for the work I'm doing that's been invisibilized, that's so essential to capitalist reproduction, but I want to get paid so I don't have to do it anymore, right? And so that's kind of like the spirit of why we continue to work within an imperfect system, trying to ritualize, communities of care, while, recognizing, yeah, these are just, in some ways we're still talking about money and wages. And I think that, what also came up in your discussion just now was like, during the pandemic, I started working closely with a community member in Baltimore who's been fighting against displacement caused by Johns Hopkins, but during the pandemic, taking over sort of a community center, converting one of the empty rooms into a storage supply center, and being part of these like weekly food distribution runs. And that still continue despite the pandemic being over, right? And I think like proliferating, like at the Law Center, I'd love to see us identifying and seeing how we can support these efforts in ways that may not involve our legal instincts of, oh, we need to protect what's going on by formalizing it into an LLC or a nonprofit, right? Because that's generally been our lane. But how can we do so in creative, ways that involve, either kind of an expansion of lawyering to meet a new moment, or just like a retraction of lawyering, and also by that token supporting, I hear your sort of critique of O'Brien's examples, but when moments like encampments occur like they are in a generalized way across the nation in solidarity with Palestine right now, I think, like, how can we support these mutual aid efforts so that they don't run the course of being attacked or closed down by the forces of power, right? And that's something I think as lawyers we can have. We provide a particular skill set and analytical tool to these conversations, perhaps. So I'll stop there. Oh, can I also actually shout out just O'Brien? I recently finished her Everything for Everyone, an Oral History of the New York Commune, 2052 to 2072 book. And it's sci-fi, but a lot of, just a lot of the imagination. There's one chapter from the Family Abolition book that sort of reads like sci-fi, but she takes it even further and really kind of plays around with what if an anti-capitalist revolution is won, how are communes going to exist in the future? How are new family dynamics going to exist? And this kind of gives her take of what that might look like. And it's a fun, easy read. So I recommend folks to check that out.
Nice. Well, once again, thank you so much for joining this discussion. That's part of the Future of Work grassroots fundraising campaign. There's a link to donate below if you'd like.